Let's talk about Walker Percy, Love in the Ruins. This is, I suppose, a dystopia or utopia or satire set in 1971. This was written, so set in the future, 10, 20 years on. And in many ways, it actually maps okay onto that in the future. In some respects, we'll get onto that. But so it's a dystopia, utopia, satire. It's a character study significantly of the main character. It's a discussion of modernity and post-modernity. And in the 70s there, you're talking very much at the start of post-modernity in many ways. You know, the beginning of the discussions around some of the concepts involved. And this is the blurb. The blurb isn't amazing. I'm going to add to it. But the blurb says, Dr. Tom Moore is the creator of the ontological lapsometer, a kind of stethoscope of the human soul. With it, he embarks on an outrageous odyssey to cure mankind's spiritual malaise. Ultimately, he begins to understand what he can never really know, the value of life and its susceptibility to chance and ruin. The subtitle is The Adventures of a Bad Catholic at a Time Near the End of the World. So Percy is best known for writing The Moviegoer, one of many people consider one of the great 20th century American novels. I've reviewed it on this channel before. I would basically describe it as a much better Catcher in the Rye. He was also the nephew of Will Percy, the poet and writer, and he writes the foreword for Percy's memoir, for his uncle's memoir. And this is one of, I think he had 5 novels and 3 collections. He wrote essays and stuff. He was increasingly chiefly a writer. He was a trained psychiatrist who, due to a bout of TB, didn't really practice much beyond training. And yeah, really interesting writer, very close friend of the historian Shelby Foote as well. He is a really beautiful writer, really writes beautifully. He is witty. He is good at, in both the novels of his I've read non-fiction of his too, both novels I've read of his, he has a very strong narrator. And they are different characters, these two characters, but he has particular interests which come up in between the two, written about 10 years apart. Cultural, spiritual malaise, and things to do with the southern United States and reconciling its identities. And yeah, so that there's some technical stuff there that is useful to know. What I'm going to start with, basically, I thought this was a really good book. It is not as good as The Moviegoer. It's not one of the best novels of the 20th century kind of list book, but it is probably undeservedly forgotten because of a few things, and I'll touch on those in a moment, but I think it's worth revisiting if what I'm about to say sounds interesting. But first, let's talk about the flaws, and that's because I think to understand the strengths actually partly is to understand the flaws first. There's 2 things that are really flaws, one of which is not really wholly a flaw, it's just a fact. The first, the real flaw, is structurally, pacing-wise, something like that. It has an interesting structure that he just about pulls off. Basically, it is largely set over 4 days from July the 1st to July the 4th. We actually start on July the 4th and then we go back day 1, July the 1st, July the 2nd, July the 3rd, and then back to July the 4th, and the action finishes. And these are the days where an increasingly drastic situation emerges in his kind of home in, because Percy lived in Louisiana, though he'd come from Georgia and Mississippi. Let's just remind ourselves if we can. I think it's a I think it's near coastal, just off the coast of Mississippi or Louisiana. But yeah, so in this place things are going drastically wrong. Apparently they already have been going drastically wrong in some ways socially across the United States for many years prior. And we start with our hero holed up in a motel, or near a motel, in this kind of semi-desolate place, as apparently some kind of civil disorder is beginning and he's being fired at, and so you get, in that sense, a very dystopic future. Tom Moore is, the legend of his family is that he's descended from Sir Thomas More, the English politician, Catholic martyr, and that is partly actually, I think, a pun, so that there's the sense of utopia. Sir Thomas More famously wrote a book of philosophy called Utopia, which was a fantasy land which is halfway between the best land and no land, something you couldn't achieve or wouldn't want to, a pun. It's a Greek pun. And so in that sense, this kind of weird way in which we're trying to work out whether this is dystopic or whether there might be a more hopeful strain starts from the off. And structurally, it's interesting. He just about pulls it off, but there is this thing through the middle of the book, July's 1st to 3rd, basically, where there is some degree of lag and sense that you're not sure always what's happening or what the stakes are. I think this begins to this does improve by the end of the book. It's strong at the start and the end, and in fact the whole second half to a degree. So maybe July the 3rd as well, I think I thought was stronger. But yes, there's parts of the first half which are quite slow and baggy, and I took a while to read through, whereas the second half I pounded through and finished over 100 pages, 150 pages in a day. So there is this pacing issue which I think is due to the ambitious structure, but also begins to show itself in stylistic tics, which are very characteristic of Percy, but where there is a certain kind of ironic and satiric mode, mordant wit, Dr. Kirk would put it, but a certain mordancy, which can become just a little distracting, because the surrounding pace and structure is slow and therefore confusing. Not confusing like Book of the New Sun, which I've recently recommended, because it's intentionally weird and baffling, but confusing because I suppose there is stuff being unsaid which maybe needs to be said, things that are not him being subtle but simply maybe untidy, and you're kind of having to ride along for a bit. So there is a bit of that. That said, you also have the feature of a narrator who is a drunk and quite severely depressed. A significant factor, very early on, his daughter died several years ago, and he and his wife have divorced. And a significant feature of his character is that he is a bad or Catholic or lapsed Catholic or whatever you want to say. He believes in it all, but he doesn't go to church and he doesn't really want to engage with it. So there's this tension in his personality where he is, he's more religious than many people around him who are probably, basically much more serious about trying to live up to their morals or whatever than he is. He has fallen away in many ways from many things he values. And yeah, the other part of the plot, so that is the flaw, the other part of the plot, which again, this takes a while to emerge, but I wouldn't really say this is a flaw, but just to sum it up here, is he comes up with this device that allows you to work out whether people are too abstracted and floating in the ether of the world, not focused on things, or too animalistic, too unable to separate themselves from their desires, barely better than animals. And he's trying to work out, a big thing is that he's like, okay, and if I can identify this, how do you then treat these problems? Because these are the malaises of modern society, he thinks. And that device becomes very important. It becomes something which people want and is influential and really matters. And in other synopses, you'll get that, will it prove the difference between helping everyone or hurting everyone? And all this transpires in 4 days. And there's stuff around that to do with both his narration, this kind of sometimes confused or overly laconic narration, and the way the plot advances, which maybe initially you might be confused by, but there he pulls it off. There you get much more of a, there's something really weird going on, and I don't fully understand it, but I don't think I'm meant to. And Tom Moore doesn't entirely understand it. So, there's a shared narration there. It's not unreliable narration per se, but there is a limited narration and a very personified narration. You spend a lot of time in this guy's head, and he is at points a pretty weird or difficult person, both of them, and he owns up to that. You can see he deals with that and stuff that. And here's an important point: is if you do read this book, you might be some set in and you think, God, man, this guy is really unpleasant. But I think or in this one respect, he is a likable narrator. He is not a bad guy. He is a good guy. But you're like, I don't like that. Am I meant to like that? And I think it's something where Percy, though some of it, he leaves a range of behaviour open to be discussed and analysed. To some degree, he's also pretty clearly will resolve some of these things and comment on them and deal with them and resolve them in the context of the plot and the character. So then the second thing, which is a limitation for some people, is how much I realise that because I've read literature around what Percy does and was interested in, you know, he's writing in 1971 in America, he's a Southerner writing about the South, he's dealing with race relations, he's dealing with the Vietnam War. In fact, there is something called the Ecuadorian War, which lots of people, including Tom Moore, have served in. It's not really discussed very much, except tangentially. Oh, people talk about this, or oh, he served in Ecuador. But it's basically obviously a Vietnam thing where North Ecuador is this, you know, communist country and South Ecuador is not. But it's all a bit of a nightmare, and it's not really clear what the stakes were, and that's intentional. You're kind of left with this vague thing that everyone knows about the Ecuadorian War. This leads, by the way, to one great gag where there's a protest where someone, you know, this doctor is American doctor is carrying around a picture or portrait of the North Ecuadorian hero, who's the only person who can unite North and South Ecuador, so the Americans should stop opposing him. And Tom says, didn't he parachute into Ecuador and kill all the locals, South Ecuador? And the guy says, yes. And so, you know, now everyone who's left in South Ecuador, in that region of South Ecuador, likes him. There's a lot of that kind of this is the flaw. I'll then bring that point up. Basically, this is the thing, that there are lots of references, lots of discussions, lots of topics which are much more immediately recognizable to an American of a certain type in 1971 than perhaps now. But then some of those issues are definitely still pertinent, or will feel pertinent. Some of them are, you know, certainly, though it is not the same situation, certainly some of the discussion he's having about race relations is something that there's enough common knowledge of, and there's enough continued discussion of in America and in its satellites like Britain, that, you know, you're not going to be baffled by. Some of it you can just ride with. There's a lot of humour, there's a lot of kind of extrapolation of the political situation in 1970s America, which I suspect, you know, some people might be like, oh, you could extrapolate that now, 50 years later. Things haven't changed that much. It's very funny on that stuff. And this is therefore when I'm saying it's a flaw or a limitation, because some people might say, well, I don't really know about Southern literature in that period. I'm not really interested in that. But the flip side is that with even a passing knowledge of some of the things, you realise there's a lot of humour, a lot of funny, you know, it's very funny. At points I smiled a lot. I guess I laughed once or twice, but, you know, I'd say it's more of a smile book. There's lots of just quite sly, clever, witty observations, or things like how, you know, the way that politics has degenerated into ever more comical partisan forms, the way that communities have separated. But you think this sounds very tragic, but and in fact you find more and more out about this as the book goes on. But there's, you know, there's a kind of enough loving ribald wit that it doesn't seem just cynical. And one thing is, it's interesting, it's something you might expect, particularly through the first half. You might think, oh, he has a particular set of politics. But he doesn't. There is a shotgun approach. It's very much like Joseph Heller, who I have there in Catch-22, where Heller just decides he's going after everything and everybody involved. And in this very different situation, not the Second World War, but 1970s America and thereon, and indeed modernity, Western modernity, he is going after everyone and everything with the same humour and the same affection, the same penetrative insight. It's something where I don't know how much I could quote out of context in terms of the dystopian or utopian, particularly dystopian extrapolations, or the jokes which would either make sense or which would not be, you know, I perhaps be flirting with too much controversy, because they're out of context. You'd be like, oh, is this attacking this group or this group? Because to some degree he is, but there is an affectionate approach where he is attempting to highlight the universal flaws of the way ideologies work, the way you know, opposites mirror each other, but also he's very keen to observe what makes people good. I don't mean he gives an exhaustive moral philosophy, or to the degree he does, it's not what you'd expect. But the fact that he's willing to just point out and argue for unglamorous goodnesses in fact, goodnesses other people regularly mock, particularly. And we also, you know, the degree of unsparing reflection on the soul of the individual 45-year-old psychiatrist in a rural place who kind of has a bit of a joke practice and who has got himself into a miserable situation, you know, largely he thinks by his own doing. These are real strengths, and I really enjoyed them. He is, as I say, a really beautiful writer, and I will read one very short piece. Just, it's not even a particularly important passage, but it's just shows his way with words. I lie at the edge of the willows and watch. 300 yards upstream. Nope, here's the one above it, yeah. My knees make musical rubs in the sharp, cool, shearing sand, which is wet only on top. Not bad. I missed the end of the Mariner by no more than a few yards, hitting the lower docks at the fourth slip. This end of the dock is unroofed and low-lying, designed for skiffs and canoes. A reef of alligator grass runs in front of the slips. Mullet jump. Gold dust drifts on the black water. The bayou is brimming from a south wind. Upstream, yachts and powerboats drift in their mooring. Sunlight shatters like quicksilver against their square sterns. It's very beautiful, it's very clever, it's very creative. I'd say what it does in terms of dystopia and utopia is genuinely clever and impressive and interesting. It's for a very specific audience. I don't think, put it this way, your YA dystopia crowd are not going to be like, man, the latest hot dystopia off the presses is Love in the Ruins by Walker Percy. But I think if you want a more subtle, ruminative, adult, more demanding dystopia sci-fi, I think this could be of interest to you. I would recommend it on that basis. I will not be held responsible for disappointment in it. I think it is a very specific kind of book, but within that category, it is a very, very good book. If you want a more generally appealing book by Percy, I would highly recommend The Moviegoer. Anyway, if you have read this, tell me what you think in the comments, and tell me your other favourite dystopias. Till next time.